Okay, hello again. This is Adrian, and today we're going to go over how to basically create the app from scratch. So what you can do is just pretty much delete everything. I mean, you could keep some things like the main function and the MyApp, but we'll delete everything but the material.app since that is a little redundant to type. And see, there are a little bit of suggestions. If you don't already have it, I recommend downloading Github Co-Pilot. It is a very useful AI for common functions and features that you can basically have suggested towards you. In this case, we won't be using that.
So when we're creating our FizzBuzz app,
we want to have a main function, like I mentioned previously. And in this main function, we want an app to be called. In this case, MyApp does not exist since there are no widgets. And a cool feature, if you've downloaded the Flutter extension, there is a cool feature where if you type in STLS, it'll autocorrect to Flutter stateless widget, and STFUL, it'll show a Flutter stateful widget. In this case, since we just want a main page that does not really change that much, we're going to want to have a stateless widget. So we type in STLS, and we just type, I just press tab, and it'll show you, it's highlighting these class name widgets. So we're able to change that to whatever we like. So I changed it to just say MyApp for simplicity. And there, we got rid of the error. And since this app is not changing and it is a stateless widget, we want to have a const in front of it. You'll see a lot of code. They'll kind of, especially in VSCode, they'll yell at you when you don't have const, since const is very useful to save memory and all that. So we want to specify that. So there'll always be like blue squiggly lines like you saw before, when you should have a const variable before a widget or anything like that. So inside this MyApp stateless widget, we're going to be returning a material app. First, we want a title, and that'll be FizzBuzz. Then we'll want a theme, and we kind of just autofill that with a theme data and the primary swatch to be blue. That just means we're setting the primary default colors to be blue whenever you create a app. And for the home, which is basically the home page where the app will first be set up, we want my home page widget, which we have not created yet, so that's why it has an error. I'll pass in a title, and we'll have the title be FizzBuzz. So after you've created this MyApp stateless widget, we will create the my home page stateful widget. So, and then I type in my home page, and you see how it changes all these very nice and neatly. So it's very useful to use this extension since it saves a lot of time and effort. And inside this my home page, we will want to accept that title that is being passed in. As you can see here, we just have the default key being passed in, as well as another parameter which we want as title. First, return a scaffolding. First, want to have an app bar for our name, and inside this app bar, we will set the title to be a text widget with that passed-in parameter of title. After this app bar, we will create a body with a center widget. Inside the center widget, we will create we will set a child with a column. And we use a column since it is vertically stacked a lot of the widgets a lot of the time, so it's just for ease of use. Inside this column, you can set the main axis alignment here. We'll have a children parameter where we're able to pass in multiple children. In this case, we're going to want to have a text widget that we can use string interpolation to basically change the value. We will default set it to FizzBuzz, and style of the text widgets to make it look a little bit nicer. You see how it's kind of spacing it properly every time you want to, every time you add a column, or a comma, sorry, after a parenthesis or a bracket, you will be able to kind of line it up like this. So it's a little bit easier to read. But what I'm doing is hitting Control S on Windows to save it, basically, and you can kind of see how it's reloading it here. So it saves and reloads it, and basically that formats it properly, as well as updates the screen with a quick hot reload. You need FizzBuzz, but since we want that kind of in the center of the screen, it is centered horizontally, which is what this widget does. However, it's not centered vertically since we have a column. The center widget only applies to the immediate widget afterwards, not the following ones. So within column, we're able to basically center it vertically. And main axis is for whatever widget you're using, either column or row. The main axis is the axis along which the widget is lined up. So for column, it'd be vertically. For row, it would be horizontally. So in this case, we want to line it up vertically. So we do a main axis alignment parameter, and we pass in a main axis alignment .center. That basically centers it along the main axis. And as you can see, the main axis alignment, it's centered vertically inside the column. So now that looks a lot nicer. Now we can move towards a row. So it's kind of like the opposite of a column. It is horizontally stacked. We will want to pass in some more children. Use either elevated button, text buttons, or in this case, just since it's pretty easily set up to be the default good-looking button, we will use a floating action button. As you can see, a floating action button just has a kind of circular shape, and it's a lot easier to set up than any of the other buttons, plus it has some very simple features. Now, moving on to what you have inside of the floating action button. As mentioned in the previous video, we have an onPress function, which we can kind of just set parentheses and the curly braces as default, which means it's an empty function that does nothing, but it still is able to work, and I'm able to click on it, as you can see. When we also want a tooltip, so it's just a good, even though you don't necessarily need it for all applications, it's a good habit to get into, so that it's able to help people out when you do have a icon that's kind of hard to see. So I prefer to use icons, and so what we could do is have a constant icon. We use constant since it is not going to be changing. We have icon, and then icons dot exposure 0. This basically creates a better looking 0. It's a little thicker. Instead of having to deal with styles and all that, we can kind of just have a good looking 0 from the get-go. We will be going to create a basically 3 buttons to do the 3 basic mathematical functions of incrementing, decrementing, and zeroing the values. So what I'm doing here, I created 3 very similar looking floating action buttons. Although this code is copy and paste, which isn't really ideal for a situation like this when you do have multiple widgets. There are builders as well as other widgets that you can use to prevent, code that you copy and paste and looks very similar. We won't get too much into that. All you need to know is that you can create 3 buttons in a row like this, and since they are kind of stacked together as well as hovering the edge, what you could do, you remember how I mentioned main axis alignment? What you could do within the main axis alignment is you can either do center like this, where you have all of them in the center, but they're still close together. So if you kind of just type in main axis alignment dot, it'll or just start typing it in, I believe. Usually it shows recommendations, but there's one called space between, which basically means there's evenly spaced between the edges and each of the widgets. So when I save it, or sorry, just between each of the widgets is it's evenly spaced. I believe if you do space around, it does space between each of the features of the edges of the screen and the each of the widgets inside of it. So that looks a lot nicer. None of these buttons really do anything, so we want to create some functions as well as variables for them to change. So if we scroll up a little bit, right past our build function, I believe it's here, yes. So whenever you want variables that are going to be easily accessible, as well as things that are going to be changing in this My Homepage state, you want to do it right before this override function, or this override variable, or object, sorry. And in this case, we will first want a integer counter. It's good habit to have an underscore or just some either before or after, just so that it's more recognizable compared to widget names or function names. So we just do counter first, then we have a void with an increment counter. It's recommending it to me already, however, but we will type it out. So inside this increment counter, we want to basically set the state of the counter to be changing. Inside this function, we're going to want to change the variable of counter, and in this case, very similar to Java code in C++, you can do ++, or you could do plus equals 1. It's just saving the extra characters from being written by doing counter ++. And we have 3 functions: increment, decrement, and 0. So we're going to want to create 3 functions, and they're all going to be changing that same variable. So it is already all recommending it to it. So we'll have the decrement counter, and then we will have 0 counter here. When I save it, nothing changes about it, except for the fact that we have a new variable as well as some counters. So now, if we go back down to the floating action buttons, we will see that the onPressed parameter does not have anything passed in. However, it can take a function. So what we will do is pass in the 0 counter, because it's the 0, 1. Then in this one, we will pass in the increment, or decrement, I believe, sorry. And this one, we will pass in the increment counter. And once we save that, you will see that once I press this, it changes all the variables, but there's nothing to be displayed. There is no variable to be displayed. So that's why we have to use string interpolation. The string interpolation, we can go back up to the text widget, which shows FizzBuzz, but nothing else. So below that, we can set another text widget, basically to have a string interpolated variable. So we use the $, and then underscore counter. And that's basically a variable. See, it's set to 0, but however, when I press any of these buttons, it changes the value in real time, and we're able to basically increment and decrement this in 0 in real time. FizzBuzz, whenever anything is divisible by 3, it should have a fizz. Whenever it's divisible by 5, it'd be by buzz. It'd say buzz. Whenever it's divisible by 3 and 5, it'd basically say FizzBuzz. So what we're going to want to do is basically create a function to return a string that we can put into this text widget. And what we can do is, just before this override function and where all our other functions are, we can create a function which returns a string type named FizzBuzz. What we do is, if the check of the counter is divisible by 5, and if the counter is divisible by 3. What this kind of % is doing is taking the module of each of these variables. If you've never taken a computer science course or any other language, this basically checks if you take a certain number, like example 5, and divide it by 5, if the result is equal to 0. So that means it's checking if it's divisible by 5. If it was, say, 6, for example, if you did 6 mod 5, it would leave you with 1. So it basically subtracts 5 as many times as it can until it gets before, -1. So it goes until it's still only a positive value. And in this case, we're checking if it's divisible by 5 and divisible by 3 at the same time. We also do check if it's divisible by 15, but this is just a lot easier for people to understand. So in this case, we want to return FizzBuzz. And the reason we're checking if it's divisible by both first is because if you check if it's only divisible by 5 and then return a value, you won't be able to see if it's divisible by both. So if you want to check if it's first by both, and then you want to check if it's individually divisible by each of the other values afterwards, if that makes sense. So in the else if, we want to check if the counter is divisible by 3, it does not matter really the order if we check 3 or 5 first, but we still want to return fizz in this case, since that was the whole problem. You return fizz if it'd be divisible by 3, or buzz if it'd be divisible by 5, and we have this function, but it does nothing so far, so we have to implement this function. Since it does return a string, we can pass it into our text widget here
by calling the FizzBuzz function. If you didn't notice earlier, I made a mistake with the logic, and instead of returning a blank value, I returned a counter, so that's what I'm fixing here.
Yes, so we will have it. Yeah, so if you see, if it's 0 is divisible by 5 and 3, so that's why we have FizzBuzz. And then we would do 1, 2, 3, does fizz, 5 buzz, 6 fizz, 9 fizz, 10 buzz, and then once you get up to 15, FizzBuzz. And it does work in both positive and negative directions, if you check real quickly. But yeah, if you don't want to be completely empty on any of the other ones like this, you could have it be returning as a dash dash dash, just kind of like an intermediate. But it's up to you kind of on what you would want to display when it doesn't really have that. And that's kind of the overall structure of it. If you guys have any questions, please check out the Discord or look at the GitHub repository page where we have more comments explaining what each of the features are, as well as a GIF kind of showing exactly how it functions as well. So thank you for watching and have a nice day.